Connecticut East This Week is supported by
the Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling is a nonprofit organization which, through advocacy, prevention, and education, is here to support individuals and families who are impacted by problem gambling. Our helpline, 1-888-789-7777, is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also have live chat and tech support through our website, www.ccpg.org.
It's a broken system in the state that's just getting worse. We talk about the state's tax system and how it's impacting the towns and cities where you live, forcing them to make almost impossible decisions that impact you. Plus, we take a look at other stories making the headlines from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith. You've probably seen your property tax go up or maybe even your car tax over the past several years, and naturally you blame the town or city you're living in. But the reality is the state of Connecticut and its tax system is broken and needs fixing. In this podcast, I talk with Joe DeLong, the CEO and Executive Director of an organization called CCM, as well as Michael Passero, the Mayor of the City of New London, and John Salamone, the City Manager of the City of Norwich, to find out just how bad the situation is and the pressures they are facing to balance their budgets when continued changes and pressures are handed down from the state to them to provide services with the same or sometimes less money, while the state continues to report record surpluses each year. Welcome to Connecticut East This Week. Joe, I'm going to start with you. Just for people out there listening who may not be aware of your organization, the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, just explain to us what your role is.
We're the municipal association that the towns and cities across the state of Connecticut are members of. And what we essentially do is we work for the collective. So a lot of things that a city or town maybe wants to do or wants to express but don't have the resources on their own, we bring all these mayors and first selectmen and town managers together, and we're able to represent their collective interests, both at the State House as well in some areas where numbers matter in terms of like joint purchasing and things of that nature to try to provide better services to our citizens in the state and at a lower cost.
Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the governor's recent budget proposal, in particular property tax, which is always a touchy subject. Talk to us, Joe, a little bit about that. Why has this become even more polarized this time?
It's actually a difficult conversation for me because I truly can start off by saying I like the governor. He's an affable person. I enjoy talking to him. But his administration has been particularly difficult in terms of its policies when it comes to property taxpayers in the state. And this year, it's exacerbated in his budget proposal to the point to where, for many of these towns and cities, it's just untenable what his budget would do to either raising property taxes to a limit that people frankly could not pay, or to cutting significant services. And if you look at I could go over his whole administration since he's been there and how difficult this has been. But if you look at just this year alone, in terms of education cost sharing, most cities and towns' budgets are really driven by the education side. Since Governor Lamont has been in office, they have shifted in real dollars about $407 million a year out of the state budget into local budget. So instead of the state paying its share of public education, they're now saying, we're going to hold our costs down. You cities and towns are going to pick up this additional $407 million. They've taken about $19 billion of taxable property off of the tax rolls and not covered the expenses for that, therefore shifting that burden to everyone else. In terms of where they do reimburse non-taxable property through what's called the pilot program, payment in lieu of taxes, pilot has been underfunded by about $400 million. And a lot of folks in Eastern Connecticut are obviously familiar with the tribes. Well, years ago, there was an agreement done with the tribes when we created casino gambling that created this thing called the Pequot Mohegan Fund. And all the way back into 2002, towns and cities were getting about $135 million a year out of this Pequot Mohegan Fund. the fund has continued to grow. It hasn't shrunk. It's continued to grow. And what was once around 132, 135 million a year is now down to about 52 million a year. So it's this constant push of let's look like we're doing good things on the income tax. Let's look like we're doing good things on the sales tax. And let's push all this pressure downhill for the mayors and city managers and first selectmen and councils to figure out. And then when people's property taxes continue to go up, they won't know that it's us that's doing that. And I think that we've tried to be very cordial in those discussions over the years, but I think we're hitting a tipping point now, particularly with a lot of our members who are saying, we just can't do this anymore.
Let's turn to John Salamone, City Manager for the City of Norwich. John, talk to us about how this impacts the City of Norwich.
It's a double whammy because last year we had mandated revaluation. In the state of Connecticut, it's mandated every 5 years you had revaluation. So last year we had a large shift in the way you pay your property taxes. It used to be higher for commercial manufacturing. Last year, it shifted tremendously to residential. Even though we had an increase in the grand list, it just shifted. And it shifted to a lot of taxpayers whose assessment went up 50%, 75%. So they were now paying double, in some cases, what their former property tax was. Now go to this year. And because we had revaluation last year, we lowered the mill rate to compensate for the increase in value. So there's no increase in actual revenue for us because we lowered the mill rate. Because if you didn't, then you'd be collecting all this additional money and it wouldn't be fair to the taxpayers that are going up anyway. We're losing at the state $3 million because our mill rate went below the threshold for being reimbursed for the car tax, which still exists, but it's a big blow to us. $3 million is about 3% of the budget. Actually a little less than that, but around that. In addition to that, because the mill rate went down, we get less pilot. So it's insult to injury. We lose about another 500,000 in pilot. We're still trying to figure out the tax exemption for disabled veterans. I think that we had to define better. So all in all, we're losing about $5 million in revenue before we even start the budget this year. Now, that's 2 mills before we even start, and very difficult to go forward with that. Our budget, which we're in the process of preparing now, will have a substantial tax increase, even though we had very substantial increases last year because of the revaluation. So that's why I called it a double whammy, a double negative whammy.
And that's no insignificant figure at the end of the day in anyone's mind. Let's turn to Michael Passero, Mayor of the City of New London. I'm guessing, Mayor, you're not in a dissimilar situation.
Yeah, New London is in a very similar situation because we also went through the reval last year. The tax burden shifted, as it did in Norwich, from the industrial, commercial grand list to the residential's property. And despite lowering the mill rate by nearly 10 mills, we were unable to offset that remarkable increase in the tax burden to our families in New London. So last year was a difficult year for our families, probably like Norwich as well. Our demographics, 60% of our families are classified as ALICE households. That's asset limited, income constrained, but employed. This is the working poor. These are families where the folks are working 2 jobs, low-income jobs, trying to cobble together enough money to meet all their needs. They're paying well above the 30% threshold just for their household costs. And 25% of our families live below the poverty line. With the increasing rents and the tight housing market, it's just been a perfect storm, to use that tired cliche, but it really has been. We were dealing with, as my colleagues in CCM know, we're dealing with a very regressive property tax system to begin with that puts an enormous burden and disadvantage on our municipalities to begin with. And now with the housing crisis that we have in this state, and especially in southeastern Connecticut, the reval system has just made an inequitable property tax system just really disastrous. So the second year, and I was warned by some of my colleagues in other cities that when I was complaining about last year's effect of the reval, they were telling me just wait till year 2. And I couldn't imagine how much worse it could get. But as John explained, it really is a disaster. We lost, because of the mill rate drop, ironically, we've lost $2.5 million in pilot reimbursement alone, $1 million lost to the grand list on the tax implications of the grand list on the motor vehicle tax. And somehow the calculations of the state funding for education, ECS, and everything is completely flat. So we're dealing with an $8 million hole in our education budget, and with fixed cost increases on the city side, a $3.5 million hole in our operating budget. These are holes that you just can't climb out of. And if raising the mill rate and raising taxes on our families who are already living in poverty, it's not an option. So our only revenue source, we can't go there. So what we're looking at right now is just having to gut the ability to run a local government. This is the crisis year for a city like New London, I presume for a city like Norwich. And somebody in Hartford's going to have to look at this system and understand that we need some real systemic change here.
Joe, weigh in on this for us, if you would, a little bit more. We've just heard from 2 major cities here in southeastern and eastern Connecticut. They can't make the figures add up. Can anybody?
We're talking about 7 years, Brian, of budget surpluses at the state level. I mean, let's be honest about that. We're talking about 7 years of budget surpluses at the state level. But the state and the governor's budgets have not even kept pace with inflation in terms of their responsibility to towns and cities. Now, when you're in massive budget surpluses and you're not even keeping pace with inflation, so it's not that you're just holding firm or holding flat, that every year you're pushing more and more pressure. We understood it somewhat during the Malloy era because we had some tight budget times. And so everybody had to mutually feel a little bit of pain, and we had to figure it out together. But now that we're having all of these budget surplus years, it just seems to be this constant desire to push more pressure downhill and more pressure downhill. And our local taxpayers can't handle it. And I get a little offended when we hear in like a budget address that, hey, we're going to increase your exemption on your state income taxes by $50 a year for your property taxes. We're giving you $50 a year additional exemption to really help you out. I don't know who that helps out, but if my property tax bill goes up $500 or $1,000, I don't really care about your $50 exemption at the end of the year. We need an actual partnership and policy change. And just earlier this week, Brian, I think it was actually on Tuesday when the statement went out, the General Assembly recognized how much that the state was underfunding its share of the excess costs, the special needs children in our school system, and pushing all of that burden down the hill on towns and cities. And the General Assembly leadership said, listen, this has to stop. We've got to do something here. And we're going to put $40 million additional dollars in this year to help our towns and cities because we know this is a catastrophe. And the governor came out and put out a statement and called them irresponsible for doing it. So I don't know how it's responsible to continue to bleed people who are in poverty and the working class and middle class people. So you can claim that you haven't put any additional pressure on wealthy people, or you can claim that you're controlling the state budget so well. It's not that the state budget is being controlled that well. It's not that people are being protected. It's being the towns and cities and the property tax is being used to cover up for deficiencies at the state level, or for the state to do things that make them look good, while at the same time pushing tremendous pressure down into the most regressive part of our tax system that we have, and really hurting the people who can least afford to be hurt I think you have some really good state legislators in Eastern Connecticut. We really need them and other state legislators to do, frankly, what they've been doing, which is standing up to the governor and saying, enough, like enough. We have to go home and live in these communities and they just can't take anymore.
At the very least, they have to address this immediate problem of the municipalities that have gone through the reval process in the last 2 or 3 years and the impact of the housing crisis on that. And then that impact all on top of an already broken system. So they have to look at what's happening to cities like Norwich and New London, who went through a reval last year, and that the tax burden shifting from our commercial and industrial base in these cities to our households who are already suffering. It's just exasperated an already dire problem. We've been struggling with this, the city manager in Norwich and myself in New London, we've been struggling with this for years and have figured out how to sustain ourselves. But now with the reval, it's just taking everything back, all the work we've had over the last 5 years or so since the last reval. And so they really need to at least look at a Band-Aid. They need to look at what's happened to us because of just the impact of the housing crisis, and then that reflected in the reval, and at least change some of these automatic formulas that are now really skewed to affect our cities. And they're still continuing to take properties off the tax rolls. The cities in our state have to support all the social services for the affluent suburbs that surround us, and we get no help for that. For instance, in New London, we take care of the homeless population, all of the unhoused people for all of southeastern Connecticut, and the taxpayers in New London bear the burden of that almost exclusively. The towns around us do not share that burden. We depend on the state government to cure inequities like that, to balance that system so that they spread out some of the money that's going to Hartford to help the cities, but it's not happening.
I just want to bring in this point, and I'm not moving away from obviously the responsibility of the state, but of course we find ourselves with an administration which has been putting in federal funding freezes. I'm guessing this is also going to impact cities as well. John, you must get a lot of federal money as well, but having federal money taken away is just surely going to impact that even more, isn't it?
It is, or it will. Obviously, the trend is very grave. A good example: the House of Representatives passed a budget that includes about over 10 years, about 800 billion cuts to Medicaid, and that's paid as a sharing arrangement between the federal and state government. So if the federal share goes down drastically, guess what happens? The state has a difficult choice to make. They either fund it at the level that it was funded with the federal money, or they cut back on it. It's going to be very difficult to cut back on it because the rubber meets the road at the local government and the state government. And it's going to be horrendous for low-income people to get medical care and even nursing homes. It could take your parents out of a nursing home that they exhausted all their funds and became eligible for Medicaid because of the cost of long-term care, and now they don't have that money. That's real. Now, obviously, it has to go to the Senate and whatnot, but the threat is very real, and that comes with other grants too that they're looking at in health, and especially in education, food grants and other special ed grants. On top of all this, and I wasn't even going to talk about that today because that's a whole nother level of pain that we can go through. I'll give you one more example. The state decided in their wisdom to mandate that we go to a different way of valuing automobiles. And the different way they mandated to us reduced what the income would be by about 15%. In other words, vehicles were going to be valued lower. Now, they tried to make a fix to that, but what they came up with is that you could keep it like it is, or you can change it, but you'd have to do it at the local level, which means, in our case, the city council would have to do it. And so you're deciding that you're going to keep the rates higher or you're going to lower them. That's your option. So it puts us back under the situation of how can we burden the taxpayer more with this choice, which is really no choice at all. But it sounds good from the legislature, and I hesitate to criticize the legislature. We have very good local people that try to take care of us, but the trend is not good, and we work closely with them, but we seem to still go backwards each year a little bit.
Joe, I want to give you the final word on this. It's a huge topic. What can be done?
I guess, Brian, the best example I could give that I think might hit home with people locally is just a comparison with Massachusetts when it comes. I mentioned at the beginning, one of the largest drivers of municipal budgets is public education. Do you know that in the state of Massachusetts, they spend in towns like Norwich and New London, they spend about $14,000 per student. The state does. That's its contribution, about $14,000 per student on a young person's education. In Connecticut, it's 10. Massachusetts is contributing 40% more. Our governor and our state legislature sets out policies that say, no, we'll spend 40% less because we don't want to make difficult decisions, and we'll let you guys figure out the difficult positions and figure out how to spend the extra $4,000 per student that one of our neighboring states doesn't even do. That is what we're talking about here, is how far out of line we are in these policies. On the education side, Connecticut is one of the wealthiest states in the nation. We are in the lowest quartile in the country in what the state's percentage contribution is to a young person's education cost. It is all pushed down to the local level for the local level to figure it out. And these are the types of policies that, again, we're hitting at a tipping point. We just can't continue to do it anymore because it's not sustainable. And we need the voters, we need the residents of these communities to understand that these are not decisions made at the local level. The property tax is not just local. Your property taxes are driven by the policy decisions at the state.
Joe DeLong of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, Mayor Michael Passero of the City of New London, and John Salomone, City Manager of the City of Norwich. Thank you for being on the podcast.
As veterans, we're no strangers to helping others.
That's what we were taught, service before self.
But we do have one question for the veterans listening.
When was the last time you reached out for help?
If you or someone you know needs resources, whether it's for stress, finances, employment, or mental health, don't wait. Reach out.
Find more information at va.gov/reach. That's va.gov/reach.
Brought to you by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs and the Ad Council.
Time now for a look at other stories making the headlines this week. New research finds most Connecticut residents support creating a family caregiver tax credit. Edwin J. Vieira from the Connecticut News Service reports.
The state has 420,000 family caregivers, providing a little more than $7 billion in care. Senate Bill 321 would provide a $500 non-refundable tax credit for caregivers supporting senior family members who are 50 to 60 years old and receive Social Security or are under the same income limits. Natalie Shurtleff with AARP Connecticut says this is often hard work for them.
We hear so often from family caregivers that are really that sandwich generation. They're caring for older loved ones while also still caring for younger children and trying to juggle work.
The bill is in its earliest phases, but a public hearing will occur soon. The report finds about half of all unpaid family caregivers spend their own money on home modifications and buying medical equipment like wheelchairs. Monthly spending for some family caregivers varies from spending nothing to $1,000 or more a month. I'm Edwin J. Vieira.
The Connecticut Department of Transportation, along with state and local law enforcement agencies, has launched the second high-risk rural roads enforcement campaign to help reduce speed-related crashes and fatalities on the state's rural road network. Lieutenant Governor Susan Bysowitz helped launch the campaign in the town of Montville recently, saying it was something very personal to her.
My brother was riding his bicycle on a rural road and was left to almost die. Fortunately, he did not, because the driver who hit him left the scene. Fortunately, Good Samaritan saw him and was able to stay with him until an ambulance came. So the safety of pedestrians, the safety of cyclists, the safety of our motorists is something that is very important to us.
Bysowitz said that in 2022, Connecticut had the highest number of road fatalities from speeding drivers, with 367 people killed on the state's roads and 327 deaths in 2024. The $2 million initiative will run for 91 days, starting March 1st and ending on May 30th. Leisha King is the Deputy Commissioner for the Connecticut Department of Transportation and said rural roads can be deadly.
Almost every day, we see reports of drivers in rural areas exceeding speeds over 90, 100, 110 miles per hour. These drivers are often impaired or distracted, putting lives in jeopardy because of selfish and reckless behavior. Rural roads are an essential part of our state's infrastructure. They connect communities, small businesses, and provide access to schools and healthcare. While rural roads in Connecticut may be picturesque and beautiful, they can quickly become deadly.
Connecticut's first high-risk rural roads campaign in 2024 led to over 7,600 traffic stops and 4,300 speeding citations being issued. The campaign aims to provide a more visible police presence on high-risk rural roads, as well as a statewide public awareness campaign. The special election for the 40th District saw a decisive win for young Groton Town Councillor Dan Gajewski, who beat his Republican opponent and Groton Economic Development Commission Chairman and local tech entrepreneur Robert Boris by 1,583 votes to 716, according to unofficial results from the Secretary of the State website. The special election came about after the seat was vacated on Jan 7th by State Representative Christine Conley of Groton, who is to take up a position on the state's Workers' Compensation Commission. Conley had served the 40th District, which covers portions of Groton and New London, since her election in 2016. An emotional Gajewski said he was very proud of the win.
I want to thank the voters, obviously, for coming out in a February election. It was an incredible journey, and I am super thankful for everyone that helped me get through. And there's a lot of emotion right now, and it's still a little processing.
Gajewski said it was a short and intense campaign period and that he never takes situations like campaigning or even winning for granted.
I always think I'm going to lose. That's why I campaign really hard and make sure the voters know who I am. I never take an election for granted, even with the current state of the country. And, I've seen elections where we thought that as Democrats we were going to win and we didn't win.
Republican challenger Robert Boris congratulated Gajewski on his victory, saying he was disappointed. The message here, he said, is less about local politics and more about what's happening nationally, adding that with a two-party system in the country, we're left with outcomes like this. Although Boris added he will continue to focus on the local community and economy, he wished Gajewski great success and said he will be in his corner and the district's, as he has always been. And Jeff Hamilton, President and General Manager of Mohegan Sun, has been named the Chamber of Commerce of Eastern Connecticut's 74th Citizen of the Year. Hamilton, who has been General Manager and President since 2019 and a Mohegan tribal member, will receive the honour at the casino's Earth Ballroom during a ceremony set for May 8th. Chamber staff members surprised Hamilton with the news of his selection during a Mohegan Tribal Council meeting earlier this month. Hamilton joined Mohegan Sun in 2004 before assuming his current post. He served as Assistant General Manager and previously held leadership positions in the casino's Advertising and Human Resources Department. As President and General Manager, he oversees strategic planning, project development, marketing, fiscal planning, technology, and visitor experience, while ensuring the casino's overall success. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East and on Instagram at Connecticut East This Week. And you can listen to the show again on our social platforms on demand and by asking your smart speaker to play Connecticut East This Week podcast. And please like, follow and share on your social media too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.